Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burn. I'm Felicia Jackson and I'm joined today by my co-host Heather Dinwoody. Julia is away this week, so we'll be taking on her stories. The first story that we're going to look at this week is about the G7. So this is the meeting that's starting on the 13th of June in Italy. Now, the G7 is an informal group of industrialized nations. What's interesting about it to me is that this year we are supposed to have an agreement on how the G7 is going to go about cutting fossil fuel subsidies. Now, the thing that's challenging about this is that I think the IEA's figures show that last year, $800 billion was spent around the world in fossil fuel subsidies. And in 2022, across the G7, fossil fuel subsidies hit nearly $200 billion. That's $199.1 billion. Now, the G7 has been saying since, I think it was 2009, that they have a goal of eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But to me, this sounds a little bit like the COP process decision to phase away from unabated fossil fuel. 15 years now, the G7's been talking about cutting subsidies for fossil fuels and nothing has happened. In 2016, they added a deadline that this had to happen by 2025. Well, it's 2024 and not a lot seems to have happened yet. I think where this is really challenging is, what do we mean by inefficient? How are we actually working out how cutting fossil fuel subsidies is going to work in terms of both the just transition and in terms of energy poverty? And I think it's really interesting. I know, Heather, that we're going to be having a chat with your story this week about the elections, but it's really interesting that it's a political challenge, not a technological one. I think there's very little doubt or even understanding that renewable energy, especially solar, is now the cheapest form of energy generation there is. So why are we keeping fossil fuels going by subsidizing it with such large amounts of money? And I think it's because it's a political hot potato. You know, think about the fact that these are industrialized countries. And, when we're talking about the G7, we're basically talking about the US, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK. In Europe, those countries have industrialized on the back of cheap fossil fuels from Russia. Well, that gas, those fossil fuels are no longer available, at least not cheaply. But instead of focusing on looking at the cheapest long-term option, what we've seen is a doubling down on finding alternative sources of fossil fuels. So I'm just going to ask the question, why haven't we done anything about it yet?
Well, I don't mean to be cynical, but I do understand the importance of keeping people out of energy poverty, of ensuring that jobs aren't lost and everything. But to me, that really just feels like a bit of an excuse at the moment because, so as you said, the prices of renewable energy are now a lot cheaper than the prices of fossil fuels. But the consumer doesn't benefit from that because energy prices are tied to the market value of natural gas, which just doesn't make sense because it's keeping the solar and wind prices elevated. And then you've also got, when we're talking about just transition on the job side of things, a lot of the same skills that are used in the oil and gas industry could easily be sort of either just redirected straight away or just sort of slightly molded to shape this new renewables industry. So yeah, it really does just seem like an excuse to me. That's what we need to be focusing on, is reskilling workers to ensure that those jobs are kept in a sustainable system.
And that to me makes perfect sense. But this, to me, again, is the problem, that there isn't a proper conversation going on about what this means. 15 years, the G7's been arguing about the definition of inefficient. And it's like, I know it's not sensible.
Tell you what, that is the definition.
But it's brilliant. I mean, even if you were going to be non-academic about it and take the dictionary definition, faffing about for 15 years is not solving the problem. There's even the fact that, when I'm talking about subsidies, we know that under projections for a net zero 2050, there's no room for new fossil fuel exploration. there was 42 billion in subsidies for fossil fuel exploration and production, while oil and gas companies posted profits that we've never seen before. And those subsidies don't tackle energy poverty. Any cost reduction is spread against everyone. So we really need to see a completely different political approach to what's going on with the fossil fuel industry. And I think this is where we bring in your story, Heather. And I think this is the big story for everyone this week.
Yes, so this is definitely a really big story. I wanted to talk this week about the European parliamentary elections and the slightly terrifying shift to the right that we have seen. So I know the far right parties have made huge gains in Italy, Austria, Germany, and quite notably in France, where President Macron has now called a snap election, dissolved parliament, reflecting this clear swing to the right. And this is really important because the measures that are taken over the next couple of decades are going to define the severity of global warming for this entire century. So, in the next 5-year term, members of the European Parliament are going to face some really big, really, really consequential decisions. And, how they approach climate targets, existing legislation, and negotiate any future action. It's not just about saving the planet. That's also going to sort of determine the investments. It's going to determine European business strategies and influence consumer decisions for the next couple of decades as well. And, in essence, you could say, okay, this is a swing to the far right, but what does that actually mean? And you've got to look at the build up to it as well, because a lot of these far right parties kind of piggybacked into power on the back of things like farmer protests. So they really sort of jumped on something that people weren't happy about and they made it a climate issue. And it's really been sort of spreading this climate change denialism, or just, it's not that serious, we'll all be fine. So the mood in Europe, clearly, if these far right gains have been made, the mood is clearly swinging against climate, and parties, politicians, and leaders are going to sort of take that into account when discussing new climate legislation. It's also going to have a really big influence on how the Assembly puts together the new European Commission. So that's 26 commissioners, and also the president of the Commission will be up for grabs, and whoever gets those jobs will be making critical decisions. So they'll need to defend existing legislation, work out how we're going to meet the 2030 climate targets, set the 2040 climate targets, introduce the financial and legislative measures that will give industry the resources to meet new legislation, and develop a plan for post 2030. And, it's really quite terrifying to think that could now be heavily influenced by the far right. I mean, if we take just the role of the Commission's president, for example, so I think Spain's Teresa Ribera is openly campaigning to take on the role, and she's very progressive on climate, really keen. But you've got the centre-right European People's Party has said that they would maybe accept a left-leaning Green Deal commissioner, but only if they have sort of a counterbalancing, industry-friendly person on the other side. So it's really looking like we're going to see a massive weakening of the EU's position on climate, which has always been pretty strong up till now.
There's a couple of things here that I think are really interesting. One of which is how much impact this is going to have. The other one is obviously how badly the climate coalition is communicating the benefits of its approach. Now, when it comes to the actual European Parliament and Council and Commission, the centrist parties are still the major winners. The biggest shift this year, this election, is that unlike 2019, where the Green Party made a lot of wins and therefore became an important coalition partner, now the far right making wins, so they become the more important coalition partner. It's definitely a concern, but a number of the people I was speaking to in Brussels last week were saying, it's a concern, but it's not quite as bad as you might think. What seems to have happened is that, the right wing is capitalizing on people's fears, people's concerns about the cost of energy, about the cost of living crisis, the
That's
feeling
sort
that
of what I meant by piggybacking to power on.
absolutely. But it's that feeling that people have, and you've seen it accelerating since COVID, that lack of trust in government, that feeling that the people in charge are making decisions for themselves, that they're not paying attention to ordinary people. There's a lot of anger and there's a lot of resentment. And there's a real fear that, things are in a dangerous stage. And I think what the right wing and the populist politicians have done very well is find groups to blame and make people feel better. It's that sense of blame immigration. That's the problem. Blame, criminality, and let's have more law and order, instead of actually trying to focus on the benefits of collaboration, to focus on perhaps, as I was mentioning with fossil fuel exploration subsidies, perhaps refocusing some of that money towards a social welfare network to shore up healthcare and education. And there's obviously a backlash. It's obviously going to be a challenge. It's going to make getting climate action more challenging on the agenda. But I think where it's really interesting for me is where there's been a failure to communicate the benefits of action on climate change. So what we're seeing is accusations that, it's climate legislation that's driving up costs, when we know the majority of the increase in the price of energy over the last few years has been the price of gas. This year, about half the world is going to be voting. And we've got, female leaders in South America who are quite pro-climate. But we're moving against what many would see as quite right-wing positions. Something about, energy security is always seen as a quite conservative position to have. We must defend our borders. We must defend our energy security. What we're not getting is countries and politicians understanding that level of security means domestic generation. That means renewable energy. It means powerful grids and interconnections. It means collaboration between countries. It means focusing on getting people the power they need to do the things that they need to do. I think there was a number which said there's about 10 trillion is spent every year on energy, and about a third of that 10 trillion is spent on the direct consumption of oil for transport as well as electricity. If we could just start having more reasonable conversations about the potential upside of climate regulation and legislation. There seems to be this focus on short-term concerns. It's like, this is going to cost money now, so we can't afford to do it. I get that that's scary, but how about we actually look at the system and go, this is not working. This is a system which focuses on jobs for the boys and the power of the elite. There's no sense of looking at that system in such a way as saying, let's find a way to make this work for everyone in society. And I think that's where a lot of the climate discussions have gone wrong. It's been very, very technocratic. Instead of actually saying, this is about society, this is about ensuring that everyone benefits from the changes that are being made. Those discussions are being had, but in different places. And actually, if you could just find a way of getting climate people to talk about the benefits, talk about the difference in timeframes, talk about the fact that actually the solutions that we're talking about from a climate perspective will be beneficial to society as a whole. Cleaner air, cleaner water, actually holding companies to account when they do things like they do in the UK, like dumping sewage in the water system. It's cheaper for them to dump sewage in the water system than it is to actually pay for it to be processed. So of course they're going to dump. We just have to think about the long term. And that means, and there are market supporters out there who will say this is unacceptable. We need regulation. I'm not saying it needs to be controlling the entire market, but there needs to be a baseline of protection for natural resources, for clean air, for clean water, for clean power, That would be transformational.
I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there, though, because it is about the communication. Because if you think of, I'm going to come back to the farmer protests as an example, people protesting against the EU's common agricultural policy. But if it was communicated clearly that some of the sustainability measures within that policy will actually benefit and shore up the future of the agricultural industry,
Absolutely.
then would we even have protests? Would anyone even mind? Yeah, it's really about communicating the long-term impact, and I think you've just highlighted that beautifully.
Well, clearly I should be talking to all the politicians and explaining what they need to be doing to do a better job.
I'd vote for you.
I didn't say I wanted to be a politician. That's a very different thing. I think one of the things that we need to be really aware of is that policy design is also a problem. It's not just communication. We need to design the policies we do implement to make sure they're fairer to people who are more vulnerable. Because one of the things we've seen historically with policy around renewable energy, and for example, the subsidies, I think an analysis showed that the top 30% of the richest households got 50% of the available subsidies because they know about it, because they can afford the upfront costs, because of all of these different things. So we need to think about how we structure things as well as how we communicate them. But there's definitely a really big job to be done in just repositioning climate action. Anyway, moving on to my story, which I'm doing on behalf of Julia. This is actually about nature reporting. Now, given that I've just been going on about the need to communicate on climate better, I think it's fascinating how complicated the situation when it comes to nature reporting is. We know for a fact, well, certainly the research has shown that at least 50% of the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. Actually, in all honesty, I don't see how it's not 100% because everything exists within nature. And actually, you can't work somewhere if you can't breathe and you can't get food to eat. So I'm just going to say that's a pretty holistic view of what's going on. We know that action on nature is becoming more important. The nature equivalent of the Paris Climate Treaty, the Global Biodiversity Framework, was agreed in 2022. That actually said that countries around the world were agreeing to reverse nature loss. That's not just saying we're going to stop destroying it. They agreed to reverse nature loss by protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. That's in less than 6 years. Now, one of the targets said that governments have got to require all large companies and financial institutions to regularly assess and disclose their risks. Well, we certainly know from what's been happening around climate risk and transition risk that this is really challenging. A lot of companies don't know what to do. At the moment, we have 150 million different standards. Everyone's completely confused, but we have a relatively short space of time in which to take action. So one of the things I thought was very exciting was the Business for Nature Coalition, which has basically come out and said it's approved the first 5 corporate nature strategies where companies are basically saying, we recognize these risks. This is the approach that we're taking. It's a way of addressing fundamental risks in the supply chain. And that's fundamental risk that affects everyone across every economy. If you think about the ecosystem services we rely on, I'm talking about sewage in the water and clean air. But what about fertile soil to grow food? What about the pollination of crops? What about resilience to extreme weather? These are all facets of a healthy natural ecosystem. There are risks around, degraded. We talk about stranded assets when we come to power generation. But if you work in agriculture and you've got degraded soil in your plantations, then you could have a stranded asset. It's a slightly different approach, but it's using a similar model. So what they've actually done, they've created a framework for this campaign, and the campaign is called It's Now for Nature. The idea is to show companies what a successful corporate nature strategy could look like. And they've got to actually, in order to qualify, they've got to be credible and ambitious and match the criteria. So a proper materiality assessment, one that identifies material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. And that means talking to all the people affected, not just a bunch of your supply chain. It means that you have to set targets that are aligned with those impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. You've got to avoid and reduce negative impacts on nature. And of course, this is something that comes up again and again and again. You've got to have C-suite responsibility and engagement from the board. What I loved was GSK actually is one of the first companies that has had its nature strategy approved. And the company freely admits that as a biopharma company, it is dependent on nature. So I just see this as an incredibly positive thing. There are obviously limitations to what individual companies can do. But what's really powerful is this recognition of the interconnection of nature, this recognition that if you're operating in a particular area that is under water stress, you need to collaborate with the companies that you work with in that region. You need to operate at the water basin level. So this comes to me like this idea of, land restoration where you're looking at the landscape level. Water basin restoration and reclamation. It's looking at areas where nature can be protected, can be affected by positive action by corporations. Now, it's a small step. We've got a long way to go. I know that Business for Nature is hoping to have many more such strategies approved before we actually get to the COP meeting, I think in November this year. But I guess I got excited about it because it's a step in the right direction. And it's a step beyond saying climate risk, CO2 emissions, they're not the only thing that matter. We have to take a look at the broader system and see how we can affect positive change in the world in which we live.
It's definitely interesting. Yeah, I suppose my thing would be that, it's the bigger companies at the moment that will be able to take on this new framework and new definitions. And arguably, they are the same companies that for the past few years at least have been sort of growing this awareness about nature and biodiversity. And I think what's going to be really, really important is how this sort of standardization, this development of an approach can trickle down from the big companies with the money and resources to study and implement everything, right down to the smallest SMEs and startups that we have all over the world.
Well, one of the things that connects back to the discussion we were having about better communication and better policy from government, there was a report called The Future of Nature and Business, and it actually estimated that taking action for a nature positive transition could generate over 10 trillion in annual business value and create 395 million jobs by 2030. So what that means is governments have got to recognize the long-term benefit of action on nature protection, calculate the benefit to their treasury, because that's where it all seems to fall down. Benefit to the treasury of new jobs and cleaner air and healthier people, and create some kind of policy framework which redirects disaster driving spend to more positive spend. If we could get governments and companies to recognize different forms of value and the benefits they get, we might be able to get them to work together.
Absolutely. And then it's only a matter of where we can go from there.
Which I think, given that we started before we started recording talking about how depressing the European election was, I think that's a really nice positive tone to end on.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll be moving on to our interview next.
Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. Today we're joined by Johannes Tiefenthaler, founder of carbon capture and storage company Neustark. Hi, Johannes. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Neustark, what you do?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here, Johannes from Neustark. So, some words about myself. I actually studied mechanical and process engineering in Zurich at the Technical University Zurich, so ETH Zurich. And in 2016, just after the Paris Agreement was finally negotiated, I came across the topic carbon capture and storage in a lecture at the university. And what was interesting back then was that it was clear from the policy side that we need such solutions, and also from, I would say, the scientific side. But on the other side, on the commercial side, nothing was happening. There was actually no business case, no operations, really nothing happening on this front. And I would say this was, I saw this as a big challenge, and I wanted to change that. And I would say this was my first thoughts developed to actually start my own business to make carbon capture and storage, or carbon dioxide removal, a big, scalable, very attractive business, such that we can meet the climate goals specified in the Paris Agreement.
So could you talk me through your approach? Because obviously, in order to meet the Paris goals, we need to mitigate the emissions that we make through industry and agriculture, etc. And it's generally accepted today that mitigation is not going to be enough to meet the goals. We definitely need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We need to keep it out of the way. But the way you approach things is slightly different. There's been a big report that came out recently about the fact that we're going to need to scale geological storage by nearly 1,000 times to achieve it. So how does what you do differ?
Yeah, so you are correct. We need to reduce emissions at the one side by, let's say, 80-90%. And then the remaining emissions have to be removed from the atmosphere and stored permanently. And we at Neustark offer a permanent solution to store CO2 such that it does not enter the atmosphere again. And we do it through mineralizing it. So basically, in our case, we take CO2, we take demolition concrete, which comes from old buildings, put it into our reactor. There, the CO2 undergoes a chemical reaction to form a rock, a carbonate rock, and is therefore trapped forever. So that's our approach. And what's, I would say, quite unique at this approach is that we do not only develop the technology which can do that, but we actually develop, deploy, and actually operate the overall value chain, from starting at the CO2 source, of course, building the CO2 sink, also offering the monitoring, reporting, verification, and offering a business opportunity for every stakeholder in the value chain. So we basically remove the CO2, but everyone participating can earn kind of a revenue share of the climate impact, which is then sold to a party which wants to mitigate their residual emissions.
So one of the things that's really interesting to me about this process is the idea that you're actually using demolished concrete. Because obviously one of the things that comes up over and over again is embodied carbon. It's the carbon in the built environment. So from what I understand, what you're doing is almost making a circular process out of taking concrete after it's basically its end of life. It's not used anymore because the building's been demolished, and turning that into a useful storage mechanism. So how does the process itself actually work? Do you collect the rubble, or what happens?
Yeah, so we think in so-called CO2 removal ecosystems. So one CO2 removal ecosystem for us is, I would say, an urban area. Let's take for instance Berlin. In Berlin, you have lots of CO2 sources, for instance, biogas plants in the surrounding areas, which today emit their CO2. And at the same time, you have lots of concrete recycling plants. And the business of a concrete recycling plant is to basically collect old concrete structures, so basically big chunks of concrete. They are then crushed into an aggregate which can replace primary aggregate and sand, and then they sell this aggregate mainly for road construction or for the production of concrete. So that's their core business, while the core business of the biogas plant is to produce biomethane, which replaces natural gas in the grid. And but these two streams have basically the opportunity to actually positively impact the climate when the CO2 is actually stored permanently, and also generate additional revenues. So what we actually do is that we go to the biogas plant, get them ready that they can liquefy their CO2, we go to the concrete recycling plant and basically sell them or install our technology there, such that they can store CO2, and afterwards we deliver the CO2. So we basically deliver the CO2 from a biogas plant, bring it to the concrete recycler. They use our technology to store the CO2. And what's most important in this process is actually that you need to transparently verify the amount of CO2 which has been removed from the atmosphere with a third party. And this typically works in a way that you you measure the amount which has been stored, you subtract the amount of CO2 which has been emitted through basically all additional steps like CO2 liquefaction, transport, storage, and the materials which you needed to produce, for instance, the steel. This gives the net emission reduction or the net removal. And we collaborate with Gold Standard, which is the most known or one of the most known carbon standards on the voluntary carbon market, who actually then take care of the verification and of the issuance of these credits. So at Neustark, we have kind of a bank account where we don't have Swiss francs, but CO2 credits. And these CO2 credits, they are then either transferred to the account of our customer, or they are retired in the name of the customer. And would say that that's the overall value chain, yes, which we operate, and we do this basically cluster per cluster per cluster. So every urban area is for us a cluster with this opportunity to store CO2 very locally, and thus at, I would say, economically favorable conditions, while also generating local value and jobs.
What's fascinating about this is not only does it get around this issue of, where do you actually store the CO2 that you're taking out of the atmosphere, but if that aggregate that the company's working with gets turned into new concrete or road coverings, basically what you're doing is you're taking CO2, you're adding it to something, and you're using that to create something that's needed. So you're actually not just removing CO2, but you're also removing demand for fresh new concrete, which is hugely problematic in CO2 terms. So that seems to be, it's got multiple benefits to the local economy.
Yes, so in print, I would say, I mean, it has benefits, but you have to consider that we increase the weight of the material slightly, but it's not going to change the picture entirely. So we increase the weight in average by 1%, right? The weight changes by 1%, so it's not a substantial replacement of primary aggregate. So the CO2 component is not a substantial replacement.
No, fair enough. I just got really excited about it for a moment because I love this idea that you can do things differently, because I think one of the challenges with CO2 removal is, as a concept, it's been around for 40, 50 years, but it's really struggled with getting to commercialization. And there's I think, only 40 odd CO2 carbon capture and storage plants, most of which seem to be used for enhanced oil recovery. So what you're doing is you're bringing another alternative to the market, which can be used on a sort of point-to-point place basis. And I'm assuming, because you started a business doing it, makes commercial sense.
Yeah, that's true. I think the whole space has the challenge that most of the projects, they are so big that financing them makes it easily a billion euro project, and that's very different to Neustark. So basically, we don't have this huge financial barrier, because it's lots of small projects, right? Which, if you ramp them up, also generate a very significant impact. So the objective for 2030 is one megaton. So we can do it today. All stakeholders can actually, I would say, collect experience in operating it. We are basically building an industry. We are building a market. And what's clear is that we have to step up as soon as possible also to larger scale projects. But I think we can really enable them by taking many of these small steps and generating, I would say, credibility and I would say experience, such that the larger projects are also possible afterward.
Okay, so then given that the major projects that exist are very, very large, how are you going about the business of scaling up?
So our business or our plants we deploy, and we have 14 plants in operation in multiple countries in Europe. They are already full scale. So full scale means that they basically are designed to carbonate all the concrete aggregate at the single recycling plant. And our scaling up pathway is not really increasing the size of the equipment, but working with more and more and more recyclers. And very specifically, we enter now at the next phase of expansion. So the previous one has been that we built the first CO2 removal ecosystem in Switzerland with more than 10 plants in operation. And now we go global by building in the next 2 years 20 of these CO2 removal clusters, which we have now in Switzerland, and increasing our basically our footprint in especially Europe and North America. And I would say that's the next step. And then what follows is that as soon as we have these clusters established, which remove a certain amount of CO2, we start them scaling. So we basically put more and more CO2 storage plant in each of these clusters. We're really densifying them. We scale them up by factor 10 within a few years. And this then will bring us to the megaton of CO2 removed in 2030. And 2030 onwards, we also want to tackle larger projects because we believe that's actually the right timing, where we also have the ability to do that.
Sounds amazing. So what are the particular challenges that you face? You know, is it finance? Is it policy? Is it getting people to understand the technology?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's so I think the challenge of this whole business of CCS is always, I would say, similar. So it's not, or CCS always costs more in the first moment than not doing it. So it's kind of it's a climate mitigation technology which does not come at a zero cost. I think that's very important. It's still, I would say, a very good solution compared to other solutions because it's relatively cost efficient. But it costs something. And I think that the challenge this industry is clearly facing is that the willingness to pay for such solutions have to increase over time, such that projects get economically viable. And today we solve that. We have a solution by selling carbon dioxide removal credits on the voluntary carbon market. And that's fair, that works. This enables us to scale up. But as soon as you reach a certain scale, you don't want to depend on a voluntary market, but you really need compliance schemes which are much more scalable. And I think the challenge we are facing is, and that's not Neustark specific, but that's basically specific to this whole industry, to this industry of reaching net zero, that we really need, I would say, compliance markets which enable, which offer, I would say, an attractive value proposition such that companies can scale their solutions at speed. Speed is all that matters. So actually the pathway to net zero matters a lot because that depends at which temperature increase we end up. And this means the prices will need to increase for carbon such that it's actually an attractive business for all stakeholders. And otherwise, if that's not happening, probably we are not going to reach the speed we require to meet our climate goals. So I think that's the challenge, but I think it's a good challenge, and we are on a good way there.
I think what's very exciting here is we won't go into any detail about it, but for our listeners, the fact that the EU has actually put together a framework for voluntary carbon removals. And actually the likelihood is, given the way we've seen regulation develop, is that anything that actually starts out as a voluntary one could very well move in to a compliance market, which is, I suppose, this is the key question. You talked about having a 2030 target of a megaton of CO2 removal. You know, how do you see the market developing, the appetite for CO2 removals? Because, you know, obviously you mentioned the fact that the temperature is going to be a bit of an issue, but I suppose, who is buying the credits? How do you expect to get to a megaton within the next 6 years?
Yeah, so we would say, how are we actually selling our climate impact? And we have, I would say, there we have kind of two pathways, and both of them are successful. So one is that we sell them on the voluntary carbon market, and this means that there are large corporates which have net zero commitments, and typically they follow, for instance, science-based target initiative, where they reduce and then they address the remaining part of their emissions with durable carbon dioxide removal technologies. And I mean, we are there on the spot, right? Highest quality, good cost. And I mean, customers on this basis are, I would say, tech companies like Microsoft, banks like UBS. They purchase these credits today to basically compensate their emissions, which they cannot reduce. And they also have the aim that with these purchases, they basically generate or enable the scale up of these technologies such that they can deliver impact at a much larger scale very soon in the future. So voluntary carbon market is really, I would say, one element. Another element not to be underestimated is the CO2 storage as a service. So so what we see in, would say, mainland Europe is that there are many CO2 sources which just don't have the option to store their CO2 because there is nothing around. There is no operating geological storage site. If it's very far away, there is no pipeline network. There is basically nothing. And Neustark offers probably the only solution to store CO2. And they do it either because they are, for instance, a city which have a net zero target, or there might be some other compliance schemes under which, or like regional compliance schemes, under which they can make a good business storing the CO2. And one example is, for instance, the city of Zurich. They have a net zero commitment. I think it's 2040, and they are now taking serious steps. So they initiated a tender where 25,000 tons of CO2 per year should be stored starting in 2029. And yeah, and basically we as Neustark now take care of getting the CO2 of the city of Zurich stored. And I think cities will take a very important role in decarbonization because in many cases they also own the local, or they're involved in the local utilities, which today generate large amounts of fossil or also biogenic emissions.
I have to say, you do make a convincing case. The idea that you actually able to offer additional and permanent carbon removals in a way that speaks to the local needs, in a way that sort of gets away from that issue of geological storage, is really very exciting. And if you've got the big tech companies helping to build a market for that, let's face it, we all look at what they're doing and we look to see where they're leading. I think what it really boils down to is I can't wait to see what you guys do next. I do have one question though, which is always my favorite question to finish on, which is there anything I haven't asked you about that you wish I had?
So I think your questions were spot on. So you ask, I think, yeah, everything. I think what I want to mention is that what matters a lot is speed in scaling up the technologies because we don't have a lot of time, and speed in execution. So I would say it's not very much about doing still a lot of R&D, but we really need to execute, scale, implement, because what matters is the amount of CO2 we emit until we reach net zero. That's what determines where we end up. And I think when it comes to speed, we have to do a lot of steps ahead that we actually arrive where we want to be.
And I suppose that's, in fact, a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and sustainability. It's time we stopped talking about it and time we started doing it. Excellent. Well, listen, Johannes, thank you so much for sparing the time to join us today. As I said, I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys do. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed. Do listen again next week. And as ever, you can find our podcast at your favorite platform.